Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Andrew Henderson, editor-at-large of the Nomad Capitalist report at nomadcapitalist.com and the host of Passport to Freedom.
I'm Andrew Henderson. I run a little site called Nomad Capitalist. We're going to talk this weekend about a lot of the ways you can improve your freedom, your opportunities in life, your lifestyle by looking beyond your own borders. I want to talk to you about that and share the concept of 5 magic words I've learned ever since my first journey, really, overseas when I was 8 years old. Share with you ways you can improve your freedom. We have coming up here in a little while, Bobby Casey, who was kind enough to fly in from Latvia. He travels a lot, just as I do, and he has a lot to talk about building a financial fortress. So in the interest of moving things along, normally I like to speak from here, but I hope you don't mind. I made a few notes just to keep things moving because having been to so many places in the last 6 months, I have a lot on my mind, and if I don't keep it on track, Bobby ain't getting out here till midnight, so we'll try and keep it on a fast pace. In the last 6 months, I've been to now about 12 or 13 countries. After we're done here, I'll be in Eastern and Central Europe, about 15, 18 countries before the summer. I believe that history is a great guide. Travel is a great teacher. You talk to so many people in this country and other countries who feel so constrained by the borders, whether they're 2 or 3 or 4 that surround their country. They feel like this is the only place they can be. They feel that they've been raised their entire lives to think this is the only place to live, to work, to bank, to save your money, to invest. And one thing you learn by visiting all these places, by going there, is you realize the 3 different concepts that you can improve in your own life. Your sense of freedom, first of all. Your sense of opportunities, making money, protecting your money. Your lifestyle, whether it comes to living, the cost of living, the friends you make, relationships. You realize just how similar so many places are. You go to 12 countries, 13 countries over the course of 6 months and stay in hotel rooms, apartments. They all start to look the same. You know you're a perpetual traveler when you wake up, as I have a couple times, at 2 in the morning and you look around and ask yourself, am I in Cambodia or Myanmar? But you also realize the world isn't all that bad. I talk to so many people who say, I would never go to Malaysia. I couldn't imagine going there, and I can't believe you're alive. They didn't kidnap you and throw you in the back of a van. You learn that really any place, in my opinion, can solve some of the most basic problems. I was the guy who always wanted to be in business at 12 years old. I'm going to talk about how this weekend is about transformation and my own transformation ever since I learned the 5 magic words we're going to talk about. But I believe that by looking to other places, you can solve these problems. I know that being 12 years old, being the guy who reads Jim Rogers and Bill Gates and Donald Trump books, always a hit at high school parties, but you go other places and you see, well, maybe people think more the way I do. Maybe people are more open to the idea that we don't have to be slaves to geography. I say on the radio show that we do and here to you, hello traders, because in today's Western environment, in today's United States, today's bankrupt Western countries, so many people want to tell you that just by being here, you are a traitor, that you're not patriotic. The idea that you would look beyond a set of lines on a map, that the fact that you were born on some patch of dirt that was created by politicians and run by politicians, the fact that you would look beyond that for whatever it is that you need is traitorous. But the reality is that many of us here grew up in very patriotic upbringings. I, like many of you, was born in the United States. I was born in Ohio. I remember summers driving with my family through central Ohio, the corn country, knee-high by 4th of July, and living this all-American upbringing with fireworks and apple pie and running around in the backyard and being a family. I grew up with a family that was political, that was entrepreneurial, that taught me the values of success. They taught me that you're responsible for your own success, a concept that's largely gone now in this country. They taught me how to work hard and take responsibility for what you do. It endeared to me the concept that those of us, all of us here, who have accomplished something, who have built businesses, who have created wealth, who now have questions that we need to answer because we're afraid that a government will come in and change the rules or penalize us because it's in vogue to punish success. We realize that our success was not because of that government or because of a society, because of a collective. We realize that our success is because of our hard work, because we took responsibility for our own success and for our own actions. The government wants you to believe that they are the ones responsible so that they can take your money, and we're going to talk about that this weekend. I said I wanted to talk about a transformation, one in my own life as I've gone through being a child to building businesses and now being a perpetual traveler, going around the world and seeing just how things work, realizing that there's no perfect place, realizing that the idea that one place is the end-all, be-all is not true. There are certain places better than other things. I've witnessed, though, the transformation, and we've all seen it in our lives, of going back each generation in this country, in the United States. And each generation you go back, you see your family and your ancestors who believe that this was the shining city on the hill. They called you the United States America because it was a place where you could come and create whatever it is you wanted. My family came here 4 generations ago from England and Scotland and Norway, Lithuania, not because they were desperate or desolate where they lived, but because they believed in the ideals of this thing called America, not geography, but ideals that told them they could be rewarded more than any place else, that they had a greater shot to leave a legacy to their family and create something that not only built themselves up, but built up the communities around them. And you go back through the generations. I remember my grandmother would tell me about her father, who was the Speaker of the House of Representatives in Ohio, and she would talk about how these were back in the days when the Republican Party caucused in a phone booth, but they were still fighting for this value called America. Each generation, though, our society has put less and less importance on that concept and more importance on the geography and the idea that we're born on a plantation, that we have to be accountable to the people who run it. This weekend is not about just hearing about the offshore trusts, about offshore banking, where to store your gold, what's the best metals to buy. It's about fundamentally the idea that we can transform ourselves, we can break through from the shackles that the people who run this country or any other country want to impose on us. You go around the world and you see how this has happened. You see the countries that have fallen on the ash heap of history, the lessons not learned by people in the United States and Western Europe and all of the bankrupt countries, that they think the party will never end and that they can merely legislate themselves into success. So I want to share with you 5 magic words in a moment that I've learned, that if nothing else we take away from this transformative weekend, that you can use these 5 magic words to empower yourself. My own transformation began. I told you I always wanted to be in business. I was 19 years old, and I started, of all things, a radio business. Everyone said radio is dead. I've always been a little bit of a contrarian, but people said you'll never make money being in radio now, certainly not with bad AM radio stations that nobody listens to, and I made a go of it. A couple years later, I was, I think, 21 years old. I had finally begun to achieve some success. I had a first 6-figure income earning year, and I remember I was so excited that I started to put aside all of the libertarian political philosophies that I had really espoused when I was a kid. I said, this is the real world now. You can't be worried about politics or governments or things like that. I'm here, I'm making money, I have to make the best of it. I remember I was so excited about it. I made a spreadsheet, and I had every dollar that I made on one side, and I just kind of counted it down, and on the other side, it was different deductions, and I had this formula for 40 cents, and I'm sending money off with glee to the IRS, and I remember my accountant telling me, "You're a madman." But I was so excited just to achieve this success. It all went away. But as time went on, I started traveling more the way I had as a kid. I started going abroad to countries in Asia and Europe and seeing things and making observations. Why is it over here they're making 3% higher interest on their savings, and I'm getting crushed? I'm working so hard to save money and do the responsible thing, and I'm I'm not getting what these people are getting. How come over here they have this different kind of medical care? How come over here things work differently, or they have more freedom, or the police leave people alone? I realized that the idea that we should stay and just give in to whatever the government and society told us we should was not the way to live, and I began to investigate. I started thinking back when I was 8 years old. As I said, the first time I really left the country, my parents and I, there were 3 of us at the time, we went to Europe. I remember one day we got off this cruise ship in Lisbon, Portugal. We were walking, I can still remember it, under an arch that must have been 1,000 years old, beautiful stonework. Our tour guide looked at us and said, "You guys are Americans, aren't you?" We said, How did you know that?" He took one look at us with a straight face and said, "Your shoes. Only Americans wear shoes like that." It's interesting that ever since I started picking up my own shoes, even Americans don't really think I'm an American. But he told us a very interesting story. He said, "It's interesting. You guys come from a place by the Cleveland Clinic. A lot of people here in Portugal, the government leaders, business leaders, they're going on a plane and they're going to the Cleveland Clinic. They're going to the United States. Why? Because they can't get the health care they need here. Our system is broken. It is inefficient. It is dead. The government said they would take care of it. They said, just put us in control. Just please, don't go anywhere else. Allow us to run everything, and you'll have perfect care." And what happened? People realized they couldn't get what they needed. They had to go somewhere else. They had to pick up their things. Maybe they liked living in Portugal. Maybe they liked everything else. Maybe they were even willing to pay the taxes, but the system had failed them. And it brought me back as I thought about this years later. I remembered the story. Here I was, I'd lost my way, and in understanding this concept, I thought back and I came up with 5 magic words that ever since have guided me. The places that understand these 5 magic words, I believe, are the ones that will become the new safe havens I want to share with you in a few moments. They're the places that understand human nature, the nature of capital. They don't try and fight reality. They try and embrace it. 5 words that people will go where you're treated best. And so Nomad Capitalist is the concept that you can diversify yourself anywhere around the world, that you can live one place. Where the theme of this event is fight or flight. People, many of you here may say, "I don't want to leave the United States. I have a family, I have a business, I have a home, I have a dog, a pool in the backyard," whatever the case may be. I want to stay here, but I don't trust our government to protect my money. I'm afraid that I see places like Vietnam and India taking people's gold or making it impossible to buy it. You see places like Cyprus stealing money from people's bank accounts. You see places like Argentina inflating the currency into oblivion. You say, maybe that will happen here. After all, there's no magic pixie dust that comes across any country, whether it's this one or any other. And so the idea of a nomad capitalist isn't that you have to go out and be a perpetual traveler, that you have to go to 31 countries in a year. The idea is that when you look at a place like the Mongolian steppe, one of the last places on earth where there are nomads who live out in tents in this desolate conditions, you see these nomads and how they've always lived. It's different than all of us. They have no permanent home, but they go where the food is, where the conditions are best. When the conditions are no longer best, they pick up what they're doing and they move elsewhere. They follow the best opportunities. They go where they're treated best. 5 magic words. And I believe, as I talked about the transformation, we can each make a transformation by making small changes in our lives to simply go where we're treated best, to simply take advantage of some of the materials that we're going to learn today and this weekend. When I was in business, I watched a lot of sales and motivational speakers. You'd watch Tony Robbins, for example. He talks about a friend of his who's a plastic surgeon who talks about the distance between the bottom of your nose and the top of your lip and the idea of human beauty, what everyone believes is beautiful. The difference between 1 millimeter being the difference between what is considered beautiful and what's considered average. You add another millimeter to that distance and you go from what's considered average to what's considered hideous. The changes that we can make in our own lives to enhance our freedom, to enhance the opportunities we have are oftentimes very small. You look at a guy like Brian Tracy, who's a motivational speaker. He talks about the idea of increasing your productivity 1/10 of 1% every day, just 1/10 of 1%. I was in Vietnam earlier this summer, and I talked to a guy who started this phenomenally successful business. He moved from the United States to Vietnam to start a garbage company. I love unsexy businesses like garbage companies. They're often the most profitable. You go to places like China, where people are becoming phenomenally successful, and you see that oftentimes fortunes are made through these unsexy businesses. But here's a guy in Vietnam who started a garbage company. And here's how he became phenomenally successful. He simply took the current garbage routes that people were driving in Ho Chi Minh City and Hanoi, and he tweaked them a little bit to decrease fuel, to increase productivity. It was that simple. He made small changes that made phenomenal impact on the profitability of his company and his competition. And the same thing, Brian Tracy talks about the concept of making these small changes. Today, it's 1/10%. Tomorrow, the same 1/10%. The next day, again and again and again. Every day, just making a small change to increase your productivity. And over the course of 1 year, that 1/10% each day adds up to about 26%. So if you're talking about your income, your productivity, whatever it may be, that's a big improvement. You keep doing every day, you get in the habit of increasing what you're doing 1/10%, and after 10 years, you've increased what you're doing tenfold, 1,000%. I look at places around the world, and I see places that are doing this the right way and doing it the wrong way. You look at countries like the Republic of Georgia. I was talking to someone just last night at our dinner up on the Strip, talking about what they're doing in the Republic of Georgia, how they went from 21 taxes to 6. Countries like Singapore that said 50 years ago we were not much of anything, but we want to become the wealthiest country in the world. What's the plan to do it? Well, let's get rid of regulations. Let's get rid of all the things that drive people away. After all, we know 5 magic words that people want to go where you're treated best. The countries that take those 10% improvements over time, they fix the things that don't work and that attract people. They're the ones that are growing, and they're the ones that are the new safe havens. Then there are the other countries. The countries like the United States, like many of those in the Western world, who have said, well, let's just add a small regulation here. It's pretty reasonable. We hope you'll abide by it. Or, hey, let's just impose a small tax. So a small sales tax over here. Let's tax cigarettes. Oh, this over here, it's for the children, so it's only natural. That would be normal. Everything is so reasonable. It's 1/10% at a time. It's the frog in the boiling pot of water. And over time, you take that 10% here and here and here and here, and it all starts to add up. And over time, what you see is what we've seen in the last 10 years. You see the NSA is reading your emails. The IRS wants to force you to testify against yourself because you dared to put some money over in another country because you live there or want to invest there, or maybe just because they treat you better. We've seen the things that happened in the last 10 years, and we wonder what's happening in the next 10 years because we see the acceleration of these 1/10% changes. Then they get emboldened and start making them bigger. It all adds up over time. The question is, will we find more freedom by finding the places that are making the small changes in the right direction, or will we stay in a place where the changes are going in the wrong direction? I told you I grew up in Ohio. I remember I'd spend summers with my grandmother. We'd go down for the weekend, and there'd be days when she'd cook dinner, and I would sit in the living room and page through old magazines. And she had National Geographic magazines from the 60s, the 70s. Many of the pages were kind of dog-eared or a little crinkly, but here I was, 7, 8, 9 years old, looking through these magazines, looking at pictures like things of people in the jungles of Africa who would burn different patterns on their body, or they'd elongate certain parts of their face, or they would do other things, and you'd look at it and you'd say, oh, this is so uncivilized. This is no way that we live here. Look at these people. They're in the jungles. They're savages. People have said that for hundreds of years. Western explorers have gone to places like the New World, the West Indies, Southeast Asia, India. And they've gone there and they said, these people, they don't live the way we do. They don't do things the way we do. They have different customs. They must be savages. We need to civilize them. The word civilization is something that is used in countries like this as a tool that they can keep you from accomplishing those 5 magic words of going where you're treated best. All because the government looks at other places and they say, oh, well, if you want to go to this place, they're not very civilized. After all, Oliver Wendell Holmes was a Supreme Court justice. He said taxes are the price we pay for civilization. If you never went anywhere else, you might think that. You might say, please, how do I line up to pay more taxes? You might agree with Warren Buffett and say we ought to start writing a big check and sending it in, because if we didn't, we wouldn't be civilized. There'd be nothing for us. We would just be savages. We'd be like the people in medieval times who believed the earth was flat, and they said, if you go the wrong direction in the ocean trying to find the new world, you might just fall off the earth into a pit of dragons. You have to ask yourself, are the countries that are calling everyone else so uncivilized, are they the new pit of dragons? I go to places like Singapore. I was there about 6 weeks ago. Tortney Pearson is here tomorrow. He and I sat on the Singapore River and had a $20 drink. I think, set the record for drinks in Singapore when I had a $74 single drink last April on Collier Quay. But they would tell you that if you went to Singapore, if you said, hey, listen, I want to pay no tax or very little tax or flat tax no matter how much money I make, they'd say, oh, you can't do that. They'd make you think that it's so uncivilized, yet somehow Singapore, in 50 years after breaking away from what was then Malaya, now Malaysia, said, we want to do what will build our country into the wealthiest in the world. They now are. They have almost 1 in 5 people there are millionaires because they understood the 5 magic words. People go where they're treated best. The government wants you to believe that if you go and bank in Andorra, please, they don't have the FDIC, so you might just lose all your money. Your money might fall into a pit of dragons. Yet somehow, banks in Andorra, many of them 30% liquidity ratios. You compare that with 0.5%, 1% in the United States. You look at the FDIC, and it's basically like a couple of pennies rattling around the bottom of a change jar. All this money in deposits, tiny amount that's actually available to pay. Oh, but wait, we'll pay you. We'll just give you some hot money that comes off the printing press. Please, just stand in that line over there, and as it comes off the printer, we'll hand you the money that happens when our banking system collapses. But please don't go to Andorra, because they're not very civilized. They don't have an income tax either, so they're really uncivilized. You go to Monaco and you see the boats and the yachts in the harbor. You go to the casino, you play roulette with guys with those eye patches. I don't know if you've seen anyone with a black eye patch here. I love those eye patches, like a Bond villain. But they're not civilized either. People sitting around sipping Bellinis, playing roulette at 2 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon, but they have no income tax, so they must not be civilized either. These are the things that society tells us, so we don't go where we're treated best. So we stay and we pay and we deal with whatever they throw our way. What's happened in countries like the United States and others is kind of like what's happened with the Hilton family. You take a guy who was a great entrepreneur like a Conrad Hilton. It started out with one hotel, I believe, in Texas. And there was a time when he was almost bankrupt. He had to go to his vendors. He had to sit in a conference room and say, hey, you're the egg vendor, you're the dairy vendor, you're the guy who cleans our linens. Hey, listen, I'm having problems here. We're going to go out of business. And he worked out deals with the vendors and kept the hotel chain afloat and ended up building it into the biggest hotel chain in the world at one point, creating vast amounts of wealth, one of the best business people of the 20th century. And what happened with his family is kind of what happens with Western economies, where each generation that went down, a little bit of the things that I learned from my family, the values of hard work and creating your own success, each generation, it kind of eroded a little bit, kind of washed away, and eventually, several generations later, you have not Conrad Hilton, but Paris Hilton. I kind of believe that the United States has become the Paris Hilton of countries. Sometime long ago, people were fighting for freedom and trying to build something that was great and saying, hey, listen, come here and we'll treat you best because we understand the free market of human beings, of capital. We understand that people want to go where they're treated best. So please come and do that here. But then eventually, please, we need to have civilization, we need regulations, we need taxes, and eventually you become Paris Hilton. No one knows what actually made it happen, but they have theories. They think they know. And so you have a couple different directions that you can go. The idea of this event is fight or flight. I am a guy in the flight camp. I talk about the idea that when you have the Leviathan, it's best not to fight that. I know some of you here and many people in this country believe that to take back the country and revive it. I believe that doing that is a servitude to borders that isn't necessary. I look at the concept that people call America and say, America has moved. America is in Chile or in Singapore. It'll go wherever it's welcome because it, like capital, goes where it's treated best. And so while I respect the contributions of great activists throughout history, I believe deep down that capitalism, which is what we are, we're not activists, we're capitalists. It is the best way to lift people out of poverty. It's the best way to lift the world. They say that capitalism is the best charity. I believe that. It's funny, I was in Cambodia. I was talking to guys from India who believe that so fervently, and they're saying we don't even want to believe it is a charity. We believe we have to act on our own best interest, and that'll trickle and create jobs. After all, in Cambodia, where these guys live, people went from making $80 a month serving at restaurants to making $300 a month working at high-end hotels. Why? Not because the NGOs handed them money, but because they went out and built new skills, and because rich people went there and traveled through Cambodia. I don't want to be the activist. I don't want to be the Rosa Parks or the civil disobedient. I don't want to be the person who has to take the bullets for trying to enhance a society that is fighting against you in every way. I respect the people who have fought for freedoms, but when you see how that's worked out, I ask myself, is it really worth fighting for? There's three different kinds of sovereignty that I wanted to talk about in that regard, because I really believe that by building ourselves up, we can enjoy the most amount of freedom, and that when we do that, we're enhancing freedom throughout the world. So let's get that up there. Three types of sovereignty. The first type of sovereignty is one that I believe all of us here have. We've accepted the concept that we can be free by looking out and making an active choice to seek something better. The idea that we won't be like everyone else. We will be the contrarian who is willing to be open-minded and listen to other ideas, that we want to build a culture of freedom. Whether we stay in the United States, whether we live somewhere else, no matter what we do, we want to be sovereign. Second concept is financial sovereignty. I was in Switzerland. I know I was talking to a few people here earlier who were also in Switzerland on the shores of Lake Geneva. I went to Chian Castle, one of the most famous places in Switzerland. It's a phenomenal structure. Lord Byron wrote about it. You can actually walk down into the dungeon of Chian Castle, and there's these tiny windows at the top where the seawater, the mist, the smell comes into the dungeon, just a little bit of light, as you can smell the waves and hear them lapping around Chian Castle. It's built over this Lake Geneva. Then you look behind you at the majestic peaks, the hills, the jagged cliffs. And then you ask yourself, why is this structure here? Was someone living here? Was there a business here? What was going on hundreds of years ago when this was built? And then you find out the answer. The government, or whoever was governing the place at the time, decided here's a thin road bordered by a lake, bounded by jagged cliffs, that the guys who come through here with their goods to trade on their horseback, they can't go through the lake. They'll drown. They can't climb the cliffs. They'll never make it. They'll come down this one road right in front of our castle. It's not a castle at all. It's a toll booth. We'll assess the price of their goods. We'll figure out how much we want to take of their money, and we'll send them on their way because they have no choice. Financial sovereignty, the concept that in a country, in these set of borders, the government decides exactly what happens. They'll decide what to tax you. They'll decide if there's a war on cash. Bobby, Casey, and I were talking about life in Europe and how in many parts of Europe you can't fill up your gas tank with cash now. You certainly can't sell a car in many places in Europe because the government doesn't want you to have financial sovereignty. They want to know everything you're doing because they figure by you merely being on their patch of dirt that they established, lines, they decided that they need to know. You want to take your gold through the airport, they reserve the right to investigate or to take it or to do whatever they want, and you really don't have any remedy. The idea of financial sovereignty is that you can diversify your affairs, that you can go where you're treated best. Even if you stay here, you can diversify. You can move your assets. You can do things that keep that financial sovereignty alive. The third kind of sovereignty, physical sovereignty. This is the toughest one. We talk about the concept of not only getting your assets out of a country, but getting yourself out. Will there be a time when that's something we all have to do? It's funny, you look throughout history, and you see this when you travel. I've gone to all these places, and it's so interesting to talk to people who have lived through different periods in history, from Cambodia to Rhodesia, now in South Africa, to all over the world. You see the stories of people who they and their families lived through times when horrendous things happened. Even in the last few years in Argentina, you talk to people who lived through government coming in, taking people's money, devaluing everything they had, oppressing them. It's happened in our lifetimes. In the 1960s, Myanmar came in and said, we don't need the rest of the world, we'll go rogue. Instead, they went bankrupt. It happened in Ghana in the 1950s. You see societies that think that because the party was going for a while, they can keep it going forever. Yet somehow, things always change, and physical sovereignty is the idea that we can physically go where we're treated best. The idea that if we're on this turf here in Las Vegas or in the United States, wherever it may be, that we are still subject to whatever the ruling powers decree. They can change the rules at any time, as we've seen throughout history, from the Roman Empire all the way till now. The idea of physical sovereignty. And so I wanted to share with you 7 places, 7 new safe havens, I believe. It's interesting because so many people who speak at events like this, they seem to have the same kinds of places they always talk about. There's the Singapore, and I was in Singapore. I've been there, and I like the idea of banking or putting your gold in Singapore. But people want to tell you that there are panaceas out there, that you were so unlucky as to be born here, but if you only were born in Singapore, everything would be so perfect. I don't believe that. I believe that there is no perfect place, but by using safe havens like these, we can dramatically increase our freedom by diversifying. So we're not going to be talking about Singapore or Chile or others. Some of these are a bit contrarian, but we'll get started here. Number 1 is Malaysia. This is a place where you can go and live. If you're someone who has some amount of assets, you can become a resident there. It's very easy, 10 years of residence. I'm not a big fan of bankers patting themselves on the back. It's funny, though. I was reading an issue of, I believe, Global Finance magazine, and they have all these different indexes of banking and the best banks and the best central banks. Malaysia ticks so many of the boxes in being one of the most stable jurisdictions for finance, being one of the top 10 places to do business, being one of the top places to live, probably being the most livable, affordable city in Southeast Asia. Affordable country, Kuala Lumpur being the city. For those who didn't get in on living in Singapore or living in Hong Kong, for those who missed that boat, I believe that there are new safe havens like Malaysia. I look at the idea that what could have happened if we would have all moved to Singapore 50 years ago. They would have welcomed us with open arms. They would have given us a key to the city practically. Now you have to have a lot of assets or a lot of talents or a lot of business savvy to get into Singapore, because they don't need so many people. But by looking at new safe havens like Malaysia, Malaysia is also a place where you can own a lot of property as a foreigner. You look throughout places like the Philippines, and other countries in Southeast Asia, it's often very difficult to own property or perhaps anything more than a condo. Malaysia has some of the most lax regulations, and as a result, you've got people from Singapore crossing over to Johor Bahru and other parts of southern Malaysia, and it's become the New Jersey to Singapore's New York. So Malaysia is one of my safe havens to look out for. Latvia is where Bobby Casey, who'll be with us in a few moments, comes from, or has moved to at least. He'll talk this weekend about the idea of Latvia now being on the euro. You say, wow, that's a horrible idea, Andrew. In general, I talk against dealing with countries that are part of entangling alliances. You look at Europe and you say, okay, Norway, if you want to host a website or have freedom of speech, they love that in Norway, and they don't have to deal with the EU. They don't have to deal with the EU's nonsense when it comes to banking. You look at Andorra and all the other places that are outside of the EU, that's good. Latvia. Bobby's going to talk to you about his opinion on property growth in Latvia. For a property investment in Latvia, you can get a residence there. Ultimately, a passport. I see a lot of potential in the Baltic states in general. You look at places like Estonia, where you can basically keep your money in an Estonian corporation, distribute as you see fit, tax-free. You look at countries like Lithuania, which in a couple years will ascend to the ranks of Latvia and also be an attractive destination. And you look at what's happened when other countries in the Euro zone get to the point where Latvia is and the profits that people have made there. Uruguay is something that I've talked about on our site, Nomad Capitalist, as an emerging offshore banking destination. This is a place that understands that people want to go where they're treated best. They've become one of the better places in South America to bank. To be honest, I'm not as big of a South America guy. We'll hear from guys this weekend, Jeff Berwick among them, who are much bigger proponents of South America. I love some of the countries there, and it's very interesting to see, to challenge the conventional wisdom that we've all been told. I was just talking to someone the other day, and I said, you know, Colombia is one of the top economic reformers in the world. I said, well, what about drugs? We have these ideas that have been burnished in our heads by people who don't want us to go elsewhere, who want us to stay here and have their way with us. So South America in general is good, but Uruguay, while not the cheapest place, is a place you can move and become a resident very easily. You can live there. You can become a citizen of Uruguay. Now, I don't know about you. I don't know how many people in this casino could find Uruguay on a map or had even heard of Uruguay. I think that if I made some money, I would rather have the Uruguayan IRS coming after me than the American IRS. Number 4, New Zealand. It's funny because we're going to hear from Torgny Pearson in a little bit about the idea of storing gold offshore. He's a guy who was from Sweden who told me when we met up a couple weeks ago that he believes that people in Cambodia do have more freedom than people in Sweden. Forget civilization. He talks about this 0.1%. Forget even 0.1%. They're taking away your freedoms 1% at a time in Sweden. And he's now in Singapore because so many people around the world want to store their gold, want to move their assets to a stable jurisdiction that is free of entangling alliances, a place like Singapore. And so he'll talk about moving your gold and precious metals to Singapore, but New Zealand is another place that has become one of the top jurisdictions for moving precious metals. And so I see other opportunities there. It's also one of the best places to live, best qualities of life, freedom of speech, etc. It's funny, you wouldn't think China would be a safe haven. I put this up here for a little bit different reason than the rest of them, but I look at places like China and Russia. You saw what happened this summer with Edward Snowden having to go to China and Russia. And people say, oh, he's going to our enemies, the dominions of our enemies, the places that have caused us so many problems. And I say, I don't want just one country to rule the entire world. I want a backup. I want people to keep it in check. I want China. It's funny, I was having another dinner earlier this week with some people, and we were talking about the idea of government, how it oppresses people, but again, the idea of civilization, as long as they put a good veneer on it, they can oppress all they want, and people say, wow, it could be a lot worse. We could be in China. But we talked about the idea that if we're going to deal with the government, we'd like to at least be able to live our lives as freely as possible. China's a place that I've spent a lot of time, and I see people living a lot more freely. You have a population that understands inherently that their government is bad and that government in general is bad. 2 out of 3 wealthy Chinese people want to leave. That's a society that I like, I respect. I like the idea of the Chinese currency, and I see that as a place for growth in the future. But one thing that I was a little bit hesitant before I put China on the list was the idea that I was reading the Heritage Foundation Index on Economic Freedom. I like to read this. I kind of agree with the numbers on countries like the United States, which dropped again 2 places this year. I think it makes sense for developed countries. I'm not so sure about developing countries because they talk about a lot of things like lack of transparency and police issues, things like that. And I say, having been in these countries, China, Vietnam, etc., where you don't get hassled by the police, where you pretty much are free to live your life, I say, you know what? That's good. Let the police be corrupt. Just have them leave me alone. And let the guy who picks up the garbage in Vietnam come and bribe me, because I'd rather pay $2 than have to get ripped off and have to deal with inefficient bureaucracy. But the Heritage Foundation survey on China said China was a bad place and had no freedom because they had corruption in the judiciary and they were interfering with, companies. There was crony capitalism and the police were corrupt. And I said, well, that's probably not a place I want to be. But then I thought to myself, I don't know where else they have corruption and judiciary and crony capitalism. I couldn't think of a place that would possibly do anything like that. No idea. So I decided to put it on the list. Georgia is one of my favorite jurisdictions. I mentioned earlier we were talking about the Republic of Georgia in Far Eastern Europe last night with a guy who is from Ukraine. Georgia is a place a lot of people have been moving money into US dollars, into euros, even into Georgian lari, because Georgian banks understand the 5 magic words. People go where they're treated best. Their money goes where it's treated best. Now, unfortunately, the days of 9% interest on your US dollar deposits in Georgia are gone. Interest rates are still high in Georgia, but I look at Georgia as a place that, again, realized, hey, listen, 21 taxes, that's too many. I'd like to have 0, but cutting it by 75%, not a bad start. Realizing, hey, we got to do something to get people here. We got a couple million people. We don't have 320 million people to take advantage of, so we have to do something to attract others. I think they have the right attitude in Georgia, and you can also move there. It's funny, I think, from everything I've been hearing lately, Georgia and Tbilisi in the capital is very much like Dublin in Ireland, a place I love, where you have so many restaurants and little cafes in the city center area. You can pretty much do anything you want. It's lively, it's exciting, it's teeming with life, and there's a lot of development going on in Georgia. The last place is the Philippines, where I've spent a lot of time in the last year. This is a lifestyle safe haven. I was in Davao, Philippines, for Christmas, and I spent Christmas with some American entrepreneurs there who moved to this city called Davao, which is in the south of the Philippines. And 2 days before Christmas, we all got together. They chartered 2 jeepneys. If you've ever been to the Philippines, you've seen these big like trucks, and they hollow out the back, and there's these metal seats that 24 people will jam into, and it's basically like the local bus system. It's run by the private market. People will go out and buy a single jeepney, and that's their business. There really isn't a public transportation system in the Philippines. It's run by people who run their own private bus companies, their own jeepney companies. But we chartered these 2 jeepneys. 6 or 7 or 8 of us got in the back with about 1,000 presents that these guys had purchased. And we drove around Davao, basically throwing these wrapped gifts out the window at kids who were in some of the needier parts of town. We'd try and stop, but occasionally we just have to toss it out the window because we couldn't stop in time for a kid on the side of the road or somewhere. We'd go to neighborhoods. For example, in Philippines, the beaches are oftentimes the most poverty-stricken areas. Unlike here, they're the richest. And we would have 100 kids climbing on the side of the jeepney just looking to get a gift. It was the most amazing thing that we were probably breaking 100 laws here in the United States. We would have been sued into the Stone Age for product liability and all sorts of problems. But I found, I see this amazing sense of freedom in the Philippines. I see it as a place where you can go and live very easily. Even if you're 35 years old, you can retire to the Philippines. They have a retirement program. I think they do that just to make people feel good. But if you're 35, you can retire to the Philippines for not a lot of money in the bank. You can live there very cheaply. And I see Southeast Asia as a place where there's a lot of opportunity, and you're positioning yourself in the middle of a very exciting area where you have places like Cambodia, which is getting rid of restrictions left and right on foreign investment. You have places like Myanmar, the last frontier market in Asia. You have access to all these places and a great standard of life in the Philippines. These are safe havens that we can seek out. You'll see some of them were lifestyle ones. Some of them were places to bank, store your gold, speak your mind. They're not often the same place. Again, we've been told that if only we're willing to be the frog in the pot of boiling water and suffer that erosion 1/10 of 1% at a time of our freedoms, that we can have the perfect place, or so they say. I urge you to look at these safe havens, and we'll talk about more this weekend with our speakers who have their own opinions. I tend to be, as I said, a contrarian. But I look at this as a way that we can find more and more freedom.